Hello out there, and welcome back to the GamecockScoop.com podcast, the official podcast of GamecockScoop.com on Rivals. I'm Caleb, joined by Alan. Definitely hit subscribe and like and all those things wherever you're listening. We're trying an experiment to do a Twitter space at the same time as we're doing this. We'll see how well that goes. I titled this episode "The Template for Beating Ole Miss," and I guess my real question is, how are you feeling about this game after what we saw this past weekend? Obviously, Kentucky knocks off Ole Miss at Ole Miss, and do you think that they showed a template for other teams to beat them, or was that just like a weird week, one of those things that happens in college football? It was the first sort of step up in talent that Ole Miss had experienced at this point of the season. They had played a pretty cupcake schedule up to that point. I guess, how much do you think last week is an indication of Ole Miss, or is it just a one-off sort of thing?
I kind of take it a little bit of both ways. I think Kentucky showed you a way that you can get after this Ole Miss team, that you can find some things to exploit. That being said, and I'll flip it back in a second, but I don't think a lot of teams can do what Kentucky did last week. I think what Kentucky did with that front and the physicality, kind of the way they got after Jackson Dart a little bit. I don't know if every team on the Ole Miss schedule can just roll the ball out and do what Kentucky did. However, South Carolina might be one of the ones that can with this defensive line. We talked about it all summer. We talked about it so far this season. You might have the pieces, the D-line, to sort of do what Kentucky did last week, at least to some extent. I will say I don't think you're going to win this game 20-17 with some of the questions you have on offense right now. We can get into that in a second too. So I don't know if you're going to be able to do exactly what Kentucky did last week, but I think if nothing else, you saw that a really good D-line, especially a good interior D-line, Deion Walker last week for Kentucky. Maybe you don't have one guy as good as Deion Walker, but you feel like you have the depth in the middle there between Boogie, Tonka, TJ, Nick Barrett, Goodwine, Jules, that you might be able to make some things happen up the middle and get after this Ole Miss offense a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you started there, because to me that is kind of the path to South Carolina pulling the upset, and that is being disruptive of up front and making some big plays. Kentucky sacked Jackson Dart 4 times last week, and even in the games where they played some overmatched teams like Georgia Southern or man, I don't even remember who their schedule was. They beat every team by 60 for a while there. But even in those games, the offensive line was looking a little bit shaky. On GamecockScoop.com, we have a From the Other Side article posted yesterday where you talked to Rebel Grove's Neil McCready, and he mentioned that offensive line was already like a concern heading into the offseason, but then they've had injuries to Caleb Warren, Gurquan Scott, Jeremy James, Jadam Williams. And then we were just looking at the injury report, which we'll get to here shortly, because I know you guys are very concerned about that on the South Carolina side too. But we were just looking at the injury report, and it's like a laundry list, and several.
It's a high school graduation class that Ole Miss has listed as out or questionable for this week.
Yeah, pretty wild. So it does seem like up front there are some things that could be exploited, and obviously at this point in the season, South Carolina has proven that they can take advantage when an offensive line isn't quite at full strength. I mean, even when they are, right? I think we've agreed that LSU's offensive line is one of the best that South Carolina will see all year, and they still were disruptive in that one too. So yeah, I mean, it feels like a spot with a home crowd behind you. If you can get some big plays, maybe some turnovers or something along that defensive front, especially early, things will get really, really interesting. And that doesn't sound like as improbable of a path maybe that it did a week ago when Ole Miss was the number 16 team in the country, and this almost like playoff darling sort of team. Now I think their backs are up against the wall, and I think they had the expectation to make the playoff. And if they lose this one, it's that becomes a long shot. So
I'm glad you brought up the path and you kind of titled this podcast a template. I don't even think as much, excuse me, that it's Kentucky and what Kentucky has done or what Kentucky did in Oxford last week is your blueprint. I think what you did against LSU and the way you played in that game is your blueprint, minus the self-inflicted wounds, the turnovers, the penalties, everything like that, some of the play calling. I think, and I was saying this to Neil a little bit, answering one of his questions, which is over on rebelgrove.com now. You have already shown that you can play with, you can control the game, you can lead for most of the day against a top 15 caliber team, against a great quarterback, against a great offensive line, all of that. You just got to cut some of your own mistakes down. You got to execute better on your own end. And I think you could win this game as much with your own blueprint as what Kentucky did last Saturday.
We're going to get a lot more into the X's and O's and some of the matchups that we see. But I know, like I said a second ago, on the front of everyone's mind is kind of the injury status of Lenora Sellers, Rocket Sanders, and Jared Brown. We just got our first official injury report like 20 minutes ago, not even 10 minutes ago. What can you tell me about that? And then, yeah, maybe some of the key guys that you noticed on the Ole Miss side showing up on that report as well.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the South Carolina injury report because that won't take me an hour to get through. There's only 5 players listed here. Ja'Kiah Moore's out. We already knew that. He's been out all year. Kelvin Hunter is doubtful. That's a new name, but he hasn't – I don't know if he's played other than garbage time against Akron and Kentucky. I don't think he's played like a high leverage snap this year. That's the true freshman DB. And then the big 3, right? Your leading passer, your leading rusher, your leading receiver, as we said in the last podcast, Rocket Sanders, Jared Brown, Lenora Sellers, all 3 questionable right now. Pretty tight-lipped from Beamer yesterday on that. He said that Lenora Sellers did everything in practice. He said Rocket looked good in practice. He also said both those things. I guess Rocket wasn't injured leading up to Akron, but he said that about Lenora leading up to Akron. I think there's a better chance. If I had to choose one, I think there's a better chance Lenora plays than Rocket. I don't think that's a lock. I don't want people to think that it is. But I think Lenore's just, his injury is 3 weeks old now. Rockets is 2. I mean, Beamer already also said, too, let's not forget that Rocket would have been out if they'd played last Saturday. So I think that's worth remembering, too. It's going to be a challenge for sure. As for the Ole Miss side, there are 25 players on the availability report here. No other SEC team has more than 10. 12 players questionable. Nobody else has more than 4. I don't know if that's Lane Kiffin trying to game it, trying to do whatever, but a few names that caught my eye here. Trey Harris was the big one to me. That's their leading receiver. He leads the country in percentage of completions for a team. He's got 43% of the catches this year for Ole Miss. He's questionable.
He's already got 800 yards receiving through 4 games. That's nuts. That's an insane pace. Anyway, sorry, go
ahead. Henry Parrish, he's questionable. It's their leading running back. Oh boy, the pronunciation. Princely. I don't even want to try. I don't want to mess up his name, but the defensive end Princely, who transferred from Florida, he's questionable. There's just a lot of here you just don't know for Ole Miss, and we don't cover Ole Miss. We don't know exactly what's going on there, but I think this is at least something to keep an eye on because we're going to get another injury report tomorrow night, another one Friday, and then the last one 90 minutes before kickoff on Saturday.
Yeah, another running back, Matt Jones, JJ Piguse. He's their starting defensive tackle, or at least in the 2 deep. I think you mentioned their 2 corners, Brandon Turnage, Trey Amos. They're both probable, but I mean, that's still interesting. Actually, a 3rd corner, Chris Graves Jr. as well. Yeah, maybe this is just like a gamesmanship thing, but this is crazy. This is definitely the craziest one I've seen since they started making these a requirement. I think if 90% of these guys end up playing, that maybe the league will have to assess this sort of technique or whatever. But still very, very interesting. We do know they're beat up on the offensive line. We do know that their running backs are beat up. So obviously they lost Logan Diggs, who was expected to be their starting running back preseason. And now they have 2 on this report. And they did not run the ball very well against Kentucky. So that's another thing I kind of wanted to talk to you about is if South Carolina can shut down their run game, which seems, again, like a reasonable thing to think that they could do, get them into some 3rd and longs, then, those defensive ends that have been so impactful at this point in the season really stand to make an impact once again. I don't know. It's really, I mean, we haven't even gotten into Ole Miss's defense, which I think is also pretty good, which we saw against Kentucky as well. But to me, it's setting up to be not quite the shootout that we were expecting. Although you mentioned earlier that you think South Carolina's going to have to score more than 20 points, and I do agree with that. But I don't know. Both defenses seem to be the strength coming into this week.
Yeah, I have a question for you actually that I looked up last night, but I want to see what you know. And this kind of leads me to my main reason I think you might be optimistic if you're South Carolina, at least, kind of going back to that blueprint. Ole Miss touched the ball 11 times against Kentucky. Do you know what their longest possession was by time out of those 11?
Well, yeah, they go fast. I think when they scored fast. You asking for minutes or plays?
Minutes.
4 minutes.
3:08 was their
Wow.
longest possession of the entire game. And why I bring that up because Kentucky ends up doubling up Ole Miss in time of possession. It's 40 minutes to 20. I might have been a few seconds off, but it's pretty much 40 minutes to 20 when that game's over. Ole Miss is on the field defensively for 75 plays. And you saw late in the game when the chips were down, when Ole Miss was up 4 trying to protect the lead, those guys were tired. Like, you saw hands on hips. You saw them not be able to, get out in space as easily as they were earlier in the game. And I kind of bring that up to say it's more of maybe a philosophical football question, but like, what's the point of running tempo if you're just going to go 3 and out? Because all that's doing is tiring out your own defense. I thought there were several times last Saturday in that Ole Miss Kentucky game where Ole Miss had a little momentum. Defense just got to stop, give them the ball back. You go 3 and out in a minute. Maybe you get 1 first down. You punt in a minute and a half. Turn the ball over, whatever. They go so fast. I almost think at times, when you're scoring points and you're moving the ball, it looks great. You scored 76 on Furman, 52 at Middle Tennessee State. When you're moving fast, it looks easy. It looks easy when you're moving the ball, but they tired out their own defense almost, at least I thought on Saturday. And that's always a danger when you run tempo. And if South Carolina can get a few stops in this game, I don't think anyone's expecting a shutout. I don't think anyone's saying that's on the table, but if you can get a few stops, if you can get a few of those quick stops, and if you can keep your offense on the field for some extended drives, I think there's at least a way you might be able to see, again, going back to the blueprint you brought up, a way where Ole Miss kind of tires its own defense out again, and that helps you in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I mean, that is how you beat teams that are set up like this, right? I mean, even South Carolina fans should remember Chad Morris's offenses at Clemson, and those years that South Carolina won 5 years in a row or whatever. Clemson was running up and down the field on pretty much everyone else they played, but same story where you were able to shut them down enough that by the end of the game they were gassed and you still had some energy. So I do think that that's part of it. I think being at home is going to be a big advantage there as well. You can do a few of the things to kind of slow them down that you maybe can't do so much on the road. Not suggesting that people fake injuries and stuff like that, but it's a little bit easier to do at home.
I mean, you saw the injury from Ole Miss though last week, right? The fake injury from their running back.
Yeah, I mean, then they do it themselves too, right? To try to give their own defense a little bit of time if they score too quick or whatever.
That's kind of what I'm saying. Like exactly that is it. That's something you can exploit this week.
Yeah, no, I think so. The real question to me is, because you mentioned the time of possession, Kentucky doubling them up and all of that. Can South Carolina have some success running the ball? And so much of that is going to depend on the health of Lenore Sellers, the health of Rocket Sanders, as you mentioned before. And I think you said last week when we talked after the Akron game that you think they might be able to get by with one or the other missing, but not both. And I tend to agree. So I think if Lenore Sellers is still struggling to run at full speed, there's an argument to be made that you should run the zone read with Robbie Ashford, which he had a lot of success with against Akron and has had a lot of success with even back to his Auburn days. If Lenore Sellers is up to full speed and Rocket Sanders isn't there, I still think you can sort of make those things work, and you have the added advantage of a little bit of a better downfield passing game. What do you think about Ole Miss's strengths and weaknesses as a defense? I mean, obviously that defensive line is pretty nasty as well.
The D line, again, we see all these guys who are questionable. We'll see how many of them are playing on Saturday, but that D line almost kind of goes without saying, right? The numbers are there, the sacks. I mean, they're leading the country, leading the think it's leading the country in tackles for loss, and they're third in the country, but leading the SEC in sacks right now. Obviously, you take the Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern caveat in there. I know that. But their defense still played pretty well last week, I thought. I mean, the 20 points, that's not going to get you beat most weeks. Like I said, they were on the field for 40 freaking minutes last week and gave up 20 points, 75 plays. Like, I think this defense is definitely more equipped than other ones you've seen in the Lane Kiffin era. But in terms of, where you can kind of get after it, I think you saw some receivers getting into some space last week. But I do think you're right. This does kind of come back to being able to run the ball. And my main question is for you, for Dalla Loggins, for whoever is listening, is if Lenoris is playing and Rockets out, if that ends up being kind of the combination you're dealt here, how do you design a running game this week? Have you seen enough from Oscar Attaway? Have you seen enough from, Jawarn Howell and Juju McDowell that you feel like you can run the ball 20, 30 times against a front, by the way, that we talk about them in pass rush, but hasn't allowed 100 yards in a game all season rushing? That includes last week against Kentucky.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a running threat at the quarterback position to make this run game work. I think we've seen that through this point in the season. When you don't have someone that is a threat to pull it and keep it, then defensive lines have been able to key in, and your offensive line, while improved, still isn't blowing anyone off the ball enough to create space without that misdirection. So I don't know. Oscar Attaway, I think, has shown enough. And I did think it was interesting that Shane Beamer on last Sunday's teleconference mentioned guys like Matthew Fuller and just like some of the guys that got in there late against Akron. It'll definitely be a committee approach, I think, to make up for Rocket not being there. But I think you could do enough for sure, as long as your quarterback can run the ball as well. If you have a Lenore Sellers that can run it at like 60% and you're missing Rocket, then I think rushing yards are going to be really hard to come by.
Just thinking about it a little bit more, I think this is the week you have to get the tight ends moving. And not to say the tight ends have been bad. You haven't found some success there. You've run a ton of 2 tight end sets, mostly Josh Simon and Michael Smith there, but I don't know. This just feels like if you're gonna steal this game, right, with the injuries you have on offense and some of the question marks, does it not just kind of feel like you're gonna need a Josh Simon breakout game? You're gonna need a Michael Smith breakout game. You're gonna need something extra in the passing game. And there were at least a couple times last week Ole Miss lost the tight end in coverage. So I don't know. That's just something I've been thinking about this week. I don't know if you have a thought on that, but I feel like you're, especially with Jared Brown questionable too. I mean, that's all the talk right now, and I guess rightfully so, is Rocket on the Norris. But if Jared Brown's going to be out Saturday too, or limited Saturday, you don't feel nearly as good about your receiver room either. That goes back again to where I say this just might have to be a Josh Simon game.
Yeah, and Jared Brown is your top receiver, no doubt. I think the gap between him and your number 2 wide receiver, whoever that is, be it Mazio or Vandrevius Jacobs or Gage Larvadane, is narrower than your gap between Rocket Sanders and Oscar Attaway. No offense to Oscar Attaway, but Rocket Sanders is just, he's the best running back by a pretty wide margin, I think, on the team. So I think that's why Jared Brown hasn't been brought up as much. But yeah, I think you are going to need to get your tight ends involved. I think you are going to need to see Mazio Bennett continue to take steps forward. You're going to need to hit some big plays here and there. I mean, you think back to that Kentucky game that was basically a defensive struggle, but the difference was that you made more big plays. Ole Miss obviously has the ability to make some big plays. How is your defensive secondary going to hold up? You can't be letting people get behind you like Akron did twice 2 weeks ago. Only one of them landed, but you had another wide open opportunity, which we talked about on that podcast. So yeah, to me, I think both defenses are going to play pretty well. But the difference in this one will be who makes more big plays. I don't see either team having the ability to just kind of chunk it, 8 to 10 yards at a time and consistently move the ball down the field like that.
Yeah, the corners are another good point too, because this was, I think, Clayton, either Shane yesterday or Clayton White today, maybe both. got asked kind of about, you've seen at least once in every game one of these corners get beat over the top, right? You're thinking of the first touchdown allowed against Old Dominion, where the receiver just splits the safeties. I think it was Barry and Brown against Kentucky got behind one of the corners for a big play. Obviously LSU, there were guys, especially in the fourth quarter, kind of running down the field. And then last week, you mentioned the two big plays. I think it was Judge Collier both times got beat over the top by that one Akron receiver, one catch, one incomplete. But I guess it's the elephant in the room. We've talked 20 minutes. We haven't brought him up yet. If Harris is out or limited for Ole Miss, this probably becomes the Juice Wells game for Ole Miss, right? You know what you have there. I don't think there's certainly not any love lost between those, Juice Wells and the South Carolina defense. How do you combat that, though? I guess maybe is the question. Like, do you try to press a little bit more? Jam these receivers a little bit. Are you trusting O'Donnell Fortune and Judge Collier on islands against, let's say it is Harris and Wells? Is this the most talented wide receiver room you're going to face all year? I think the best receiver period is Ryan Williams for Alabama next week. But as a room, is like a 1 through 4. This is the best you're going to see all year? I kind of think it is.
I think so, especially if Trey Harris is healthy. So I saw them. The players and Shane Beamer and everyone have gotten asked about the Juice Wells matchup, and from what I can tell, all of the responses were pretty boring. Right? Like no one gave him a headline to staple to his locker or anything like that. But I do think that there is something to be said for the way that he left after last season, after the big NIL deal he got, which is a different sort of factor than you have seen before in these sort of inter conference transfers or whatever. So the amount of money that he made here for sitting a season, obviously he had a great year 2 years ago. He's one of the reasons you beat Tennessee and Clemson. So, he exists in Gamecock lore forever for that. I think he'll be forgiven one day, for all of that. But this season right now, I do think that there is something to be said for the team's mindset on something like that. And it won't surprise me if there's some jawing, I guess, in between some plays, especially if he ends up being the featured receiver, if Trey Harris is banged up a little bit. It's definitely a matchup I'm really looking forward to. I'm sure the broadcast is going to talk about it a lot and stuff too. I mean, I just Googled Juice Wells' name and every story is about the return to South Carolina right now. So.
Yeah, I think another guy who maybe gets lost in the shuffle here too, and it's not that he's played badly. I just think he's been quieter than maybe, we talked about Donald Fortune having kind of an NFL stock raising first month of the year. I think on the post Akron shows, we haven't seen a ton from Jalen Kilgore. I think he's just been solid. He's kind of been where he needed to be for most of the year, but I think there's an opportunity for him in this game as well. And we talked about this before we got on the show, but I think really this comes down to your secondary kind of doing what it did against LSU without the big plays and how much you're going to be able to substitute up front. We know that's kind of been an identity for this team, for this defense. We've heard the term hockey shift since July pretty much from Clayton White, from players. You watch a South Carolina game, you see, 4 in, 4 out, things like that pretty regularly up front. You're not going to be able to do that as much this week. You're just not. Ole Miss is, I think I saw in their game notes, at 22 seconds between plays right now. It's, of course, leading the SEC. It's nothing you haven't faced before. You see, Old Dominion ran some tempo, and obviously the Tennessee offenses the last 3 years you faced with this scheme run a lot of tempo. But I don't think you've faced a team like this that goes this fast with this much talent since maybe you had as much talent on the D-line and you relied on rotation. And I'm curious how Clayton White and I guess Travian Robertson to an extent too, kind of calling up some of those subs is able to get bodies in and out.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely going to have to do it on more of a series by series basis than you have the first few weeks. Obviously, you will take your opportunity anytime there is a lull for an injury or media timeout or whatever. Anytime Ole Miss substitutes, which, like you said, they don't do very often, you get the opportunity to rotate them in. So I'm sure they will be on high alert for every chance to get a breather that they possibly can. But the truth is, on some of those drives, which you mentioned aren't always that long, even if they go a long way yard-wise, On some of those drives, you're just going to have to get it out, even when you're tired. You know, hopefully South Carolina feels a bit fresher. I mean, if you look at the injury report, it seems like they are. But also coming off the bye week, which is something that we haven't really talked about. But usually, when this staff over the last few years has had an extended amount of time to prepare, they've played pretty well. They've actually lost the last two. They lost to Florida off the bye week last year, which I think they still played pretty well that game, blew it late. And then Notre Dame in the bowl game 2 years ago, again, I think played pretty well, but blew it late. So before that, though, I think Tennessee, you had won off a bye week. Obviously, the bowl game against North Carolina the year before. So they do have a good track record for using these bye weeks productively. And obviously, they're off to their best start 4 games into the season under Shane Beamer. So I don't know anything there. Like, do you expect to see anything different? Was there an advantage to getting to watch, Kentucky take on Ole Miss, and is there a confidence boost there? I know Juju McDowell got asked about that. He was like, "No, we were already confident," which is the right answer. But also, I think there probably was a confidence boost, right?
I think Dowell Loggins addressed this today. I think the biggest advantage of the bye week is literally just getting healthy. I don't know if it's so much so you can change your offense. I wrote a little bit GamecockSoup.com this week just about kind of narrowing down the offense, kind of doing what you're doing best. Some players this week were talking about how they feel like they're starting to figure out what they do well more. And a bye week definitely helps that from like a self-scout perspective. I don't think you're going to see a drastically different offense. You're not installing anything, crazy new during a bye week. I think the main thing is really just getting healthy. I think I'm pretty confident saying you feel better about this if you're South Carolina playing this Saturday than you would have last Saturday, right? I know I'm aware Ole Miss lost last Saturday, but I know you wouldn't have had Rocket last Saturday because Shane said as much, and I'm not confident you would have had Lenoris last Saturday either. So I think the bye week just helps in that regard of getting healthy, getting your guys ready to go here for what's going to be not just this Saturday, but the next 3 Saturdays, a really grueling month of October here.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. Especially the injury list isn't quite as long for South Carolina, but it's obviously a little bit more impactful as far as your starting quarterback, your starting running back, like your offense, really your biggest productors, not productors, your biggest players of production. I don't know why I can't think of the right word to use on offense at all 3 positions. Your leading passer, your leading rusher, your leading receiver. So yeah, I think that makes a big impact, and I do think we've seen that they've made adjustments pretty much every year. So it won't surprise me if we see a couple of things different. I mean, you mentioned getting the tight ends out in space. Maybe that's something that we see. I feel like pretty much after every bye week that we've covered over the last 3 years, we've been like, oh, finally, it's at one particular play or something. So I expect, early on to have that reaction this coming week. Let's talk a little bit about just like the opportunity. So I can't help, and I always go down this reminiscent road, right? But I can't help but think of 2009 when South Carolina played a highly ranked Ole Miss team at home. Up until that point, the Spurrier era had a lot of hope. They had a couple big wins here and there, but hadn't really started to crest over the hill and show that they could be a consistent winner. And yeah, that was the game. That was the birth of Sandstorm and all of that. And there's so many parallels, it feels like, to that instance. It was around this time in the season 2, week 4, week 5, something like that. Ole Miss heading into that season, I believe, was ranked in the top 5, was a potential national championship dark horse contender, all of those sorts of things. They had a prolific offense. You had like Jevin Sneed and Dexter McCluster and all those sorts of guys. And ultimately South Carolina, what'd you say? Yeah, those names. Yeah. Ultimately South Carolina rode the home crowd and their defense to an upset win. That really kind of set the stage for what was to come over the next 4 years, with them starting to compete for SEC East championships, winning double-digit games, all those sorts of things. And I kind of wonder if you feel like there is a little bit of a mirror image there. If South Carolina were to win a game like this, then the entire landscape, I feel like, of the season sort of shifts. Obviously, going on the road to Alabama after what they did last week still seems pretty far off the table. But you win this one, I think you have a winnable one against Oklahoma. I kind of broke down the rest of the season over the bye week if you want to go check it out on GamecockScoop.com. But really, outside of the Alabama game now, and we used to put the Ole Miss game in this category, it feels like there's a lot more toss-ups. And I kind of think that this is getting close to that toss-up territory now. I mean, obviously, Ole Miss is favored by 8.5 points on the road for a reason. They're still the favorite, but it definitely seems more in reach than it did a week ago. And yeah, I don't know. How do you see this, I guess, as a crux point for the season?
I think, to me, the thing I keep coming back to is everything since the LSU game, since the way that game ended, was, from players, from coaches, feeling like they let one get away, that they were better than LSU, that they played well enough to win, that, some players on social media talking about officiating. Pretty much everybody who's got behind a microphone since LSU talked about mental mistakes in that game. And there's just the belief that that's a game you should have won. And I don't think it's exactly the same thing. Obviously, it's not the exact same team. It's not the college game day setting type, that situation. But it is kind of LSU part two, just in the way of you're getting a top 15 team who looks vulnerable coming in here. And if the one that I keep going back to is, and I know he's a confident guy, he's going to say it, is Debo Williams after the LSU game saying, 36 points is unacceptable. It's not going to happen again this year. Okay, well, you're getting a comparable, if not a better offense coming in than LSU. Prove it. I mean, I think this is, I don't know if I so much look at it as like the 2009 thing, although I get what you're saying and I do see the parallels. I think this is more just a prove it game. Like, at a certain point, if you kind of have the defense you think you do, if you have this kind of infusion of talent you think you do compared to last year, I'm not saying you go to Tuscaloosa and win by 30 next week. No one's saying that, but one of these types of games, I think you have to actually get over the finish line and win one of them. And that's kind of how I look at this week.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's really going to say a lot about both of these teams, right? Was South Carolina playing over its head against LSU? I think we find that out this weekend. Was Ole Miss playing down to their opponent last weekend against Kentucky? I think we find that out this weekend. Obviously, South Carolina won via the transitive property. But no, I think now we get to really, especially after this first bye week and all of that too, we get to really figure out, is this a South Carolina squad that, may go 6-6? And I still think that that's a pretty good season based off of this schedule. Or is this the South Carolina team that we saw go up 17-0 against LSU and has the potential for, a special season even, which, 8-9 wins is a special season, I think.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where you cut the line this week is if you beat Ole Miss, you're 4-1, you're going to be ranked. You still probably don't win next week, but you feel like everything else after Alabama is still on the table. If you're 4-2 at that halfway point, nothing else is going to look daunting or unwinnable if you win this game Saturday. If you lose this game Saturday, I mean, again, let's be frank, you're probably going to lose in Tuscaloosa next week. Then you're 3-3 at the halfway point. You're, what would that be, 1-3 in SEC play. And at that point, for all that you think you have or you do have, I mean, the chance for, as you call it, a special season is probably gone at that point. That really, you're just talking about making a bowl game at that point. If you're 3-3 at the halfway point and then still staring down a trip to Oklahoma after that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a inflection point, I guess, on the season. But we'll see. We'll have a few more injury updates on GamecockScoop.com over the next few days as those come out. It probably is going to just keep saying questionable until the day of, if I'm guessing. But whatever, we will report it. Before we move on, I did have a couple of recruiting notes real quick as well. If you missed it yesterday, in-state 4-star wide receiver Malik Clark decommitted from Florida State. Signs are very, very positive for South Carolina right now. He visited for the LSU game a few weeks ago. He's visiting again this coming weekend for the Ole Miss game. I wrote about it a little bit with Sam Spiegelman, Rivals national analyst, today on a Fact or Fiction about whether or not South Carolina is in the lead there, and I think very solidly yes. But if you fall flat on your face this weekend, things get interesting again. Because to me, the big reason that he picked Florida State when he did was this idea of them being a program on the rise, South Carolina, coming off of a 5-7 season, all that. Now those things have flipped in the first 4 weeks of the season, but you got to take advantage of that opportunity. Not that recruiting hinges on one game or not, but it would help. Several other flip candidates. The tight end that's committed to LSU, Tyler, is his last name. I can't think of his first name right now. I want to say it's Mike Tyler or something like that, but he's going to be on campus as well. You were getting an official visit from Michael Skinner. I don't know if that's actually still happening. Maybe because of the Tyler visit, we'll see. But anyway, I have the full visitors list on the weekly recruiting wrap up tomorrow or Friday on GamecockScoop.com, and a few more notes on just some future casts and stuff. I've already logged one from Malik Clark, and I'll probably log a couple more because some things are happening at this halfway point in the season. Well, you had the week off for the bye week, or kind of, right? And then you got back to Columbia and immediately hit the ground running because there's been some baseball scrimmages. There's been some basketball preseason press conferences, all that sort of thing. Anything notable from those events earlier this week?
Yeah, just some. We had Lamont Paris on, let's see, I can do math, Monday. Arden Conyers, that was kind of the one roster question you had right now. He sounds like he's going to be good to go. Lamont said on his radio show last week that he sprained his ankle. Didn't go into a lot of detail. Went into a little more detail on Monday. I wrote about it on Gamecock Scoop in a notebook. Sprained ankle. He missed about 6 weeks of workouts, but sounds like he's going to be good to go for the season start. I think the men's basketball thing just kind of comes down to the guard play right now. That's kind of the bulk of my question right now. They sound like they're still figuring that out too. You feel pretty good about this front court between obviously Colin Murray Boyles, but Nick Pringle, Jordan Butler. You feel like you kind of have something there, but you're replacing both your starting guards. That was something Lamont brought up yesterday or Monday. And, there's still going to be some question marks there. Baseball, not a ton. It's September. It's the first time we've seen a Paul Manieri team on a field. They've been going, I think, 3 innings a day this week. Saw Eli Jersenbeck pitch today for the first time since Tommy John. He looked pretty good. I wrote about it. If you're subscribed on the message board, I've got some notes on there. Just keep an eye there. We're 4.5 weeks from basketball now, and baseball still got a long way to go, but a lot going on in Columbia as always. And of course, it's a pretty big football week too.
Pretty big football week.
Before we games while we're here,
I was gonna say before we move on, let's get your score prediction at this point for South Carolina Ole Miss. Obviously, you can change it a little bit before you put out your final preview on Friday, and then we'll preview some Week 6 action around the country as well.
Right now, with the injury situation where it is right now, I think probably like 31-21 Ole Miss, something like that. I just think Ole Miss is going to be able to do a little bit too much. That being said, if we find out between now and Saturday that one or both of Lenore's or Rockets playing, I kind of easily think you can change that and at least have South Carolina cover that 9 and maybe win the game outright.
Yeah, to me, the path to victory is a little bit of a wonky game where you create some turnovers, which I think is possible given what you have up front and the injuries that Ole Miss has sustained. Their inability to run the ball last week, their injuries at running back, the fact that they're probably going to have to throw it a lot. I think they're going to hit some of those passes, as you said, but I also think you can probably force Jackson Dart into some mistakes, maybe a fumble or two. That's the path to victory. If I'm making a prediction, I'm going to pick Ole Miss to win, but not cover, something like 27-21.
Okay. That sounds about right. I'm kind of in that same neighborhood as you. I'm going to go ahead and fill your picks in on our staff pick sheet. I finally got off the deck last week. I went 8-1 against the spread, and I'm still under for the season, which tells you how bad the first 4 weeks were. And maybe all I need is just not pick South Carolina games to have a good week. But You're still way out in front of the picks right now. You're 35-19-1 against the spread. That is a full 8 games ahead of the next closest, which is Perry McCarty. So this week, you already said Ole Miss to win but not cover. Put that in there. Friday night, we have UNLV, who's kind of become the center of the college football world with the NIL stuff for the last few weeks, but also playing pretty good football. UNLV's 4-0 right now. At home, favored by 6.5 against Syracuse, who's also, what are they, 3-1 this year, I think? Coming to Vegas. What do you think of that game?
Yeah, does UNLV respond to all of this attention as well, we don't need those players anyway, and come out and...
They didn't last week. I know Fresno State's not great, but they beat them by 38.
Yeah, exactly. So I think UNLV wins, but I do feel like maybe it starts to catch up to them a little bit. So I'm going to have UNLV wins, but doesn't cover, which looks like that's what you have as well.
Yep. I'll go ahead and fill that in for UNLV winning and not covering. A very interesting SEC game / line here. Mizzou won its first 4 games. They were all at home. They didn't look great. They had to, double overtime against Vanderbilt. Now Mizzou hit the road for the first time. They're a 1-point underdog at Texas A&M, who quietly hasn't lost since week 1 against Notre Dame. What do you think of that game?
I think this is silly. I think Missouri is a lot better than A&M at this point.
I'm with you. I got Mizzou here.
Mizzou.
I get why the line is where it is, but yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, it does give me a little bit of pause because it feels like a sucker's bet or something. But yeah, I think Mizzou wins by 5 to 10 points.
Yeah, and it is true. The A&M is 4-1 and they've won their last 4. Little bit of a caveat there. They beat McNeese State, a completely disarrayed Florida team. Beat Bowling Green by 6 and Arkansas by 4. They still won the games, and I think any A&M fan would have taken a 4-1 start in year 1 of Elko. But I'm with you. I think Missouri's a better team and can go on the road and win this game. SMU at Louisville. Louisville favored by 7 in what is an ACC game for reasons. Who do you have here?
Do you remember who Louisville played last week?
At Notre Dame, they lost by 7, but they hung in there pretty well.
Yeah, I kind of expected them to play better than they did. I think they were down a pretty good bit for a while, and then they kind of inched back. I think Louisville's pretty good this year. Probably the best game left on Clemson's schedule outside of South Carolina. So yeah, 7 points seems like a lot, but I'll take it. It's better than 7.5.
I'm not going to lie. I don't really know why Steve put this on the sheet here, other than they both have pretty good records, at least. Virginia 4-1 or 3-1. BC's 4-1, but Virginia's favored by 3.5 in Charlottesville. BC's quarterback may be out. I know Castellanos missed last week's game. I don't know what his status is. You got a pick for BC Virginia?
I haven't watched a second of Virginia.
Yeah, I don't think I have either, other than BC Florida State.
No, I've watched a little bit of Boston College. I haven't watched the second of Virginia. I don't really know what they have. They're at home. The fact that Boston College's quarterback is a little injured, I'll just go with Virginia to cover. But I don't feel great about it. I feel uninformed.
Do you feel Virginia to win outright or BC to?
Yes. Yeah. But Virginia's favored by 3.5, right? So
yeah,
I think
cover. Yeah, you said, okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. A really good Iowa defense is getting 20.5 at Ohio State. Do they cover this, or does Ohio State just blow them out with all the athletes?
Yeah.
I'm not even going to ask you if Iowa wins the game, because that's not happening.
I think it probably looks ugly for the first half, and then Iowa runs out of gas, and Ohio State backdoor covers this one. So, yeah, I'll give them the cover.
20.5. You can win a really ugly 31-10 game, and that's a cover. 4-0 Rutgers at Nebraska. Rutgers is getting 7 points here in Lincoln.
It's a really interesting game. I think we're going to learn some stuff, but Nebraska's looked pretty good. There's always the potential that they lay an egg offensively, given who their offensive coordinator is. But I'll let Nebraska cover at home there.
Yeah, I'm with you. The 4-0 thing's fun. Rutgers did beat Washington last week, a very watered down Washington product, but they also beat Virginia Tech by 3, Washington by 3. I think the Magic might be running out for Rutgers this week in a tough spot in Lincoln. Tennessee is favored by 14 flat at Arkansas. That number kind of scares me. You'd feel better about Tennessee at maybe 13.5 or not the full 2 touchdowns. I still like Tennessee to cover, but I understand why a night game on the road at an Arkansas team that's played pretty well in spots could be a trap game. What say you?
Yeah, all those reasons that you laid out is why I'm going to pick Tennessee to win but not cover. Um, yeah, 14 points is too much for me, and I think Arkansas is pretty good. I think honestly still better than their record even indicates. Now, as they keep piling up losses, does the morale and the wheels come off? Maybe, but at home against a highly ranked team, I think they'll show up.
Yeah, I think they can show up for a bit. I don't think their offense has faced a defense. I think A&M's defense is good. It's a different beast from Tennessee's, and they only scored 17 last week, 24 the week before. The offense isn't exactly cranking it out the way it was earlier in the year. So I'll pick Tennessee to cover late. Can I call this the least hyped national championship game rematch ever? Just with Washington, Michigan both losing their coaches, both losing their quarterbacks. Washington's favored by 3. The game's in Seattle. Washington also lost to Rutgers last week. I don't know what to make of them, but they are favored at home against Michigan. What do you think about this national title game rematch?
I'm going to take Michigan to win outright.
I'm with you.
But, weird things happen in Seattle. Michigan has been a little bit bipolar at this point in the season, but I'm going to assume that did they play last week? I know
They beat
did 2 weeks
Minnesota
ago.
by 3, which is very weird because they were up, I think 24-0, and then Minnesota got back within 3 late and they held on. So kind of doing what they were supposed to do and then very not doing what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, and this is what I mean. It's just been very hard to pick Michigan games this year, so don't actually put any money on this. But yeah, I'll pick Michigan to win outright.
Yep, I'm with you, even though I have no confidence in that pick. Last game here, College Game Day is in Berkeley for the first time ever. A pretty good Cal team with a 4-1 record, taking on Miami, who escaped a very bad performance against Virginia Tech last week. I don't know if you saw how that game ended. I know you were out of town last week, but Virginia Tech catches a Hail Mary between like 4 bodies. The refs say it's a walk-off touchdown for Virginia Tech. They review it. A Miami guy was touching the ball with his leg out of bounds, which means the play's dead there before the Virginia Tech guy controlled it.
What?
So you didn't see that.
No, I didn't see it.
So you should look up the end. But Miami played very flat against Virginia Tech last week and escaped. Can they do that again? Favored by 12.5 at Cal.
12.5 is a lot of points for a cross-country
road
game.
Exactly what I think Miami to win, but not cover.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to land. Also, you got the game day crowd, all that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm going to pick Cal to cover that spread. And honestly, I might put some actual money on that one because that's a pretty
look up the end of that Virginia Tech Miami game and we're off here because it was one of the only games I've ever seen where both sidelines celebrated the win. Virginia Tech when they first called it, and then after video review, Miami sideline. It's pretty bizarre stuff.
That is wild. All right. Any final notes or anything on this upcoming matchup before we get out of here?
No, I think we're good. Appreciate you guys who tuned in either on Twitter Space or to this podcast in general. We'll have obviously another injury report tomorrow and Friday. Final preview coming out Friday as well. Probably a recruiting wrap Friday, I would assume, from you.
Yep.
Just keep it on GamecockScoop.com. We got one more baseball scrimmage this week. I don't think there's any more basketball availability this week, but keep it on Gamecock Scoop. If there's something happening, it'll be there.
Absolutely. And we'll have the live chat on Saturday for the game. I think that's always a lot of fun. A couple people have started hanging out for those. We're giving our live thoughts and live analysis and kind of keys to the game, all that sort of stuff. So come check that out on the Insiders Forum on GamecockScoop.com. We'll be back here on Sunday to break down the game on the podcast. So make sure you subscribe if this is your first time listening, and we'll see you later.